Greetings, Assalamu alaikum, welcome to this episode of the Hikmah Project podcast. Today we'll be speaking to Shaykh Ebrahim Schuitema, who is a Sufi teacher in the Darqawi Shadaliya order, and he's also the founder and a leading partner of the Schuitema Associates, a business transformation consultancy. He runs a Zawiya in South Africa, and we'll be talking to him about a number of things, including his own journey to Islam and Sufism, his relationship with his Sheikh Mustafa Basir of Morocco, as well as Carl Jung and Jung's understanding of the shadow and what that means for transformation, and Carlos Castaneda, the influence he's had, as well as contemporary issues for the seeker of sacred knowledge in the modern era, from Turuk to Beya and other such things. So before we begin the podcast, please do subscribe to our newsletter, which you can find on our website, thehikmahproject.com, and you should also now find a PayPal link and soon to be a Patreon link to be able to support the project in any way that you can. Okay, so without further ado, here is the podcast. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Today we are joined by Shaykh Ebrahim, who will be talking to us about Sufism and the path and what brought him to the path. Shaykh Ebrahim, welcome to the Hikmah Project podcast.
Thank you very much, Saqib Saab. Nice to meet you.
Pleasure to have you. Can we start off by you just telling us a bit about your own spiritual journey and what it is that brought you to Sufism?
It was sort of an incremental move. I think from my adolescence, I was, had a curiosity and an interest in the inner or inner reality. I've even as an adolescent, I'd spent many months actually in sort of advanced meditation programs, and I dabbled in all sorts of things, mainly Oriental, but also Occidental, some Christian mysticism and some fiddled a bit with Kabbalism. But this is all in my late teens and early 20s. And it became apparent to me in my early 20s that I had this sort of, I suppose, arrogant young person's dismissal of formal religion. I was brought up Catholic, so and so I had a bit of a visceral reaction to the whole Catholic thing. There were a number of things that just I found a bit offensive about some of the assumptions of Catholicism. And I thought, well, I don't really ever want to commit to any formal religion, but if I would, then Islam would be it, because at least it doesn't ask me to do anything that's offensive to my reason. And so I became Muslim in 1981 with some tablighis. And I must admit, I right from the start, I wasn't sort of doubting my decision, but I found their worldview, dare I say, medieval and somewhat offensive. And so very early on, I kind of gravitated to circles of dhikr. And the first person that who and I'm still friends with him today. The person I would regard as my first sheikh was a man called Farid Domingo, who was a Naqshbandi sheikh, but representing a branch of the Naqshbandiya that had actually been indigenous to South Africa for a couple of centuries. They'd been around at least 150 years. through the Cape. So they were actually, in a sense, completely unrelated to the more modern, people, so from Cyprus and so on. So he was my first exposure. And then from there, I had a sojourn, as many people of my generation did, with the Merabitun. The Merabitun, their agenda was quite explicitly political. And that was very attractive to people of my generation, South Africans of my generation. I mean, we kind of grew up, cut our teeth on the struggle. So, and also Islam in South Africa had a very peculiar kind of patterning that it was really people of South Asian descent who controlled the deen in South Africa. Up in the interior, it was mainly people of South Asian descent, and specifically Gujarati, but then also some Tamil influence. And then in the Cape, people of Malay descent. And there was, particularly among the people of South Asian sort of background, there wasn't a place for new Muslims really with them, and they're actually quite racist. And that racism was particularly experienced by Black South African Muslims. And so there was a growing resistance to we wanted the deen, but we didn't want to be second-class citizens in the Muslim community. And so this thing, the Merabitun thing, came like a breath of fresh air, just cut across all of this. So basically the message was, you don't need to take on what we would call an Indian identity to be a Muslim, so we all became Maliki, and we took on this whole Merabitun thing. But that became increasingly politicized by the end of the 80s and early 90s, and also had gone almost criminal. And I got increasingly disenamored with it. So I then, for a short while, I never gave bay'ah to him, but I became associated with Shaykh Hairi. And through him, I was directed to Sheikh Mustafa al-Basir, who was my Sheikh, and from whom I got my ilm. Yeah, so, and that was about 2000 when that happened. So that was kind of the rather circuitous journey.
Wow. So could you tell us more about Sheikh Mustafa and what the structure of the practice was, the training, the framework, the intellectual framework, if you like? What was the tarbiyah process?
There was none. It was the most extraordinary experience. I was Sheikh Fadlala indicated to me that I should go and see this man, because in Sheikh Fadlala's word, he was the most important living exponent of the Darqawa. And so I took my family, and we basically did a holiday to, there was a young Moroccan man who'd stayed in our house for the better part of a year. And so his family had a house in Fez. So I took my family to Morocco. We stayed in Fez. And then I planned a short visit to Sheikh Mustafa Zawiya, 3 days in that trip. I think it's about 2000 this happened. And when we arrived after a nightmare journey from Fez, because there were sort of 3 adults and three boys in a tiny car, lost in the mountains. It was an absolute nightmare journey. Sort of, we finally got to the gates of the Zawiya. We got exhausted. They said to us, they were about to close the gates for the night, and they said, Sheikh Mustafa isn't here. We don't know where he is and when he's going to come back. And so I was quite disappointed. And so I said, well, look, we'll come back tomorrow. I mean, we're clearly bombing you right at the end of the day, so we'll find a hotel or something. And they were scandalized. I said, no, you must stay here tonight. So we stayed. And when I got up for Subh the next morning, Sheikh Mustafa was in the Jamaat. And immediately after the Salah, he took me for a walk. Now, I don't speak his Arabic, and I mean, I don't speak Arabic at all, never mind his Arabic. So this young man who'd been our guest here, who was then our host, he was sort of our guide. He came with us. It was me, myself, this young man, Muhammad, and Sheikh Mustafa. We were walking through the cemetery at the back of the Zawiya. And Sheikh Mustafa said, that was explaining, about various graves and who was lying here and who was lying there. And I was trying I had a question in my mind that I was formulating. And he said something which Muhammad answered. It was a direct question, direct answer to the question I was formulating in my mind. And I was kind of taken aback. I said, Sheikh Mustafa, how did you know I was going to ask you that? And then he was taken aback. He said, well, don't you know, you and I are the same? And he pointed directly at my chest like this. He said, we're the same. I said, what do you mean? He said, we were together from the first moment. He said, we were together when Allah asked us to bear witness. And, Saqib, I had 3 days with this man. I'd never been so overwhelmed by another human being in my life. It was completely irrational. I've never considered myself to be a particularly sentimental person. But when I left that Zawiya after those 3 days, it felt like somebody had physically taken their hands, put it in my chest and pulled my heart out. It was the most heart-rending anguish I've ever experienced. I didn't weep when either of my parents died. Well, I wept like an infant when I left Sheikh Mustafa's Zawiya. But as I walked out, he put his burnus over me. He gave me his burnus. And I didn't realize the significance of that. And then he came to visit us here about 3 or 4 years subsequently in this Zawiya. And he said to me, well, I'd given you idhn then. So the extent of my initial exposure to this man was 3 days. It was completely non-rational what happened. I cannot account for it. To this day, I cannot account for it. This is one of the most overwhelming experiences of my life.
Wow. So just going back, just to put this into context, here you are, somebody who's tried different sort of paths out and explored various spiritual religious traditions. And just for our listeners, what was it? I mean, you said you came through the Tabligh Jamaat and obviously things didn't resonate in terms of the worldview, etc. But when you met these men of God, what zauq, what taste, or what was it that gave you the certainty in your heart that this is more than just mere belief system or some political ideas or just a blind following? How did you know this was authentic spirituality and this is what you was looking for?
I listened to an interview of Carl Jung recently, and it was done 2 years before he passed away. So he was an old man. And the interviewer asked him, it was like in circuits, the guy's trying to obviously trap him, you see. Did you grow up religious? Yes, Dr. Jung said religious. Did you believe in God? Yes, I believe in God. So do you still believe in God? He said. And then Jung got this strange glint in his eye and he said, well, that's a difficult thing to answer because I don't actually. I know. You have a sense of conviction and it's completely visceral. It's not in the head. And if somebody asks you for evidence, well, rationally, how can you demonstrate this? This is like saying, how can I rationally demonstrate that that there's pressure on my backside on the seat right now? It's like a strange question. It's a difficult question. You just know. From here, not from here. There's not evidential. So so the most overwhelming experience I had of this in my life was with Sheikh Mustafa. And it was, I had absolute sense that I was, in the presence of an absolutely extraordinary being. I was just completely enchanted by the man. He didn't look like much. I mean, he was about as broad as he was tall. He walked with an extreme limp. He was, he was a grizzled old man. I mean, he was kind of like suffering the whole time because he had this severely disabled leg. So he was always in pain, But I just cannot account for the experience. All that I know is not, of why should I be so overwhelmed by a person that I'd only known for 3 days? Why should I wept for a day afterwards. It was the most extraordinary experience. And it wasn't just so he came to visit us here at the Zawiya, sometime maybe 3 or 4 years after that event. And when he, both when he arrived and when he left, there wasn't a dry eye on this property. The day he left, people lined, they lined the drive. It's a long drive. It's a few hundred meters, on either side of the drive. Everybody weeping, blubbing like a baby. They couldn't understand a word the man said. He spoke Arabic. So this matter that we're after is a matter of taste and first-hand experience. It's not a matter of demonstration and argumentation. It's a different kind of knowledge. And it's a kind of knowledge that you have a complete conviction about once you've experienced it. Nobody can deny my experience. It's like that Jung quote, I don't believe in God. I know God. It's for him, it had become a first-hand experience.
Amazing. Just talking about Jung, I just came across a quote by Jung this morning, which resonated. I wonder if it's a Jungian synchronicity here, but I'm just going to quote it. He says, "One doesn't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious."
Yeah.
And one of the things I've experienced or found on the Sufi path at times, on the spiritual path generally, is that sometimes what Jung refers to the shadow is not fully acknowledged. Or maybe it's in some teachings it is, in others it might not be fully acknowledged, and the practices are generally just to do dhikr or focus on the light. Whereas he obviously here is suggesting to turn to the darkness and make it conscious, So the question really is to see what your insight is into this quote and how it relates to the tazkiyah of nafs, the purification of the nafs and character development.
I think it's a very useful way to understand one's own spiritual development as a journey of integrating parts of yourself that you've banished and alienated, as becoming more holy and fully you. It's taking the light of your attention and shining it deeper and deeper in to where your being comes from. So bits of you that were disavowed become acknowledged and integrated. That's one of the reasons why I get very irritated with people who assume that this journey is purely about becoming moral and twee and correct. It really isn't that. If you don't come to acknowledge the degree to which you are capable of absolute monstrosity, absolutely shocking brutality, then you cannot be trusted. You can only trust a person who understands the full keyboard of their being and knows that this base note of complete blood-curdling brutality is part of their nature. And that thing will never overwhelm them when they're in the wrong place and in the wrong time. The rest of us, we just play a very narrow part of this keyboard. And all of these monsters are sitting just out of view. And we don't have the objectivity, we don't have the depth of kind of gatheredness and of perceiving to not be overwhelmed by these things when they come out of the closet. So you put very nice people in the right condition and they become absolute monsters. And they'll always justify it to themselves. And they'll justify it to themselves in the name of being moral. So, I mean, you may have heard me, I mentioned this a number of times in various discussions and durus. There's I was on Hajj, and I was in the Haram, and there was a group of Turkish Hujjaj. Obviously, they're in a tour group, and the young men were on the outside, holding hands, protecting the women and the old people on the inside. So it was this almost like a military kind of formation moving through. And I saw a young Turkish man knocking this doddering little Indonesian biddy out of the way, I mean, obviously in protection of his lot, and it struck me, that man would never do that in cold reason. Here he's like stuck between a rock and a hard place. He's got to protect his own, and so he's now stuck in a spot, and here the monster that's there that he would never acknowledge in himself came out. No. So I think we cannot be trusted until we are fully acquainted with the extent of our own brutality.
So how are those areas, those monsters, as you put it, integrated and then transformed? Is that more psychological, that as Jung would have it, or does it fall under the spiritual, or is the spiritual wide enough to incorporate the psychological?
Well, I mean, maybe these differentiations aren't particularly useful. Is it spiritual? Is it psychological? Maybe, I don't know. It's all inner work. I'll give you an experience that I had. So as a child, I was always bedeviled by this idea that I wasn't recognized for my. I mean, it's very embarrassing to admit. I mean, even at 60 years old, I'm embarrassed to admit it. I wasn't recognized for my genius. As a child, I had this conviction. And it used to cause me great pain that people used to think I was just an idiot, So one day, this is like decades ago now, it was quite a while ago, I was sitting used to live on the other side of this property in a flat. I was sitting in my flat and at a bench next to the door. And I felt this was in a dream. In the dream, I'm sitting on the bench. The bench was there. There's really, and a child who was me, probably about 8 years old, came walking into the room, really crying, like snot and tears, heartbroken. And I said, "What's the matter?" He said, they don't recognize me for my genius. And I looked this kid in the eye, knowing this kid is me. I looked this kid in the eye and I said, "You know what? It's true. They don't." And it is like his demeanor changed. He wiped his face. He beamed at me, disappeared. I could feel him walk out of my chest and gone. So for me, there was that was one of the more dramatic experiences of my life, of experiencing something that was denied being integrated. It happened to come sort of in a visionary dream, but I think that is how it works. You can't deal with the pain, you see, of that thing, whatever that thing is. So you're not looking at it. The moment you round on it, you just acknowledge it. It no longer becomes. It's no longer the monster.
Mm. Yeah, I completely see that, and I think it's just that depending on the path and the spiritual sort of teaching approach, sometimes seekers or the murid, seekers of knowledge, can look to the sheikh for psychological uh, um, solutions, whether
Mm.
it's self-esteem, confidence, dare I say, depression. And I guess you're right. From one perspective, Al Ghazali might say, well, there's certain ills in the soul that can only be cured by depression. Sorry, yeah, by depression. So essentially, from his perspective, in the blessings of the tribulation, there's a lesson to be
Mm.
learned. Yeah, absolutely. So, could you tell us more about the Shadili path, its principles, and its fundamental sort of approach to spiritual journeying and development?
So again, I'm not a scholar, and so I can only give you what I've gleaned from my exposure to this over the years. And also bear in mind that you're dealing with something that's been going since the 10th century of the Christian era. So this is an ocean beyond an ocean. But from what I understood, the main elements of this tradition is that it started off as a way of protecting people who were busy with inner endeavor from getting into trouble with the intelligentsia and with the establishment. Because before, I mean, there weren't really things like tariqas for 400 years after the death of the Rasul. These things are comparatively modern. Well, they were subsequent developments. And they became developments in the first instance so that people who were doing inner work, there was some sense of them being integrated in the society and not being basically seen to be this kind of crazy counter-establishment sort of mystics. And so, as far as I understand, the Sheikh Shadli's principal aim was precisely that. It's basically to make the endeavor socially acceptable, so that people would not get into trouble and they'd still be able to do their inner work, but they'd fit. It was almost like they had a license to operate because they were part of an organization or an organized group of people who deliberately curried favor with the establishment. So that's what he did. He was politically very conservative. And he's, I think one of his most enduring quotes is, the person on this path is inwardly intoxicated and outwardly sober. The whole thing of keeping proper decorum and being outwardly consistent with the requirements of Sharia, so that you don't end up creating unnecessary disruption and having your head cut off. So that's kind of the genesis of the Shadaliya. The Shadaliya have been immensely influential in Africa. They took the deen down both the east coast and the west coasts. But it has always had this undertone of compliance, if you like. And I should think what Shaykh al-Qawi did, and again I speak under correction, I'm not a scholar on the matter, but what I understand Shaykh al-Qawi to have done is brought in an element of almost social activism again, because he was particularly active among the poor. But that's probably about as much as I know.
So, what about in terms of teaching texts? For example, in the Mevlevi Tariqa, they have the Masnavi. Is there a central text you would use for teaching spiritual principles, the Hikam of Ibn Atala? Or
no, I don't use text. I mean, I'm not hostile to people using text, and if people want that then I would encourage them to go somewhere else. My curiosity is the first-hand experience, not the narration. And so we do a lot of practice here. We do a lot of dhikr. We do a lot of, if somebody sort of comes with a hikam of Ibn Atayla or something like that, and they're looking for an erudite discourse, I would say to them, my friend, you've come to the wrong man. Please go to somebody who can. This is not my skill or my curiosity even.
So, what would a seeker of truth, if he came to your Zavia, he or she came to your Zavia, what would they find? What would you offer them?
Well, I can show you. So that's physically the place that they find.
Right.
And so they would be offered a place to stay. There would be congregational practice that happens on a daily basis that they can join. They would have access to me, where they could discuss anything that is at issue with them. And depending on how I gauge their progress, I might step up the level of their practice. We also have halfway down the hill here, we've got a khalwa. If I think the person's ready for it and the person's up for it, then we would put them in khalwa. But everything that I'm always curious about the first-hand experience. So what happens at subh when we get quiet in the morning? Our morning practice, including the salah and the wird and how quiet do you get? What are you experiencing? What are your insights? What are your dreams? What do you, so that's the sort of thing we do here. And I use principally, not text, I use principally my own experience of having worked with inner experience for my adult life in an attempt to be useful to people. And it's not everybody's flavor. I completely accept that. Very often people, they want an intellectual purity. So that relates to one of the questions you asked, Shaykh, about bay'ah. And, it's not for me to judge what anybody else does. But my own approach to this thing is my front door and my back door is absolutely open. This is living here and doing this work with people is very intense. And I only have brain space for a limited number of people at any given point in time. So I encourage people, I say to them, when I'm useful to you, stay. When I'm no longer useful to you, leave, because there's only so many chairs. I mean, I can't give everybody attention. So don't occupy a space out of some misplaced sense of loyalty. My front door, my back door, completely open. Come as you need to and go as you need to. And that's always, that has been my approach. I don't think that, because it's not been the case in my experience, my path. The people who gave me the most intellectually actually enabled the least inwardly. The people who gave me the least intellectually enabled the most inwardly. It was literally like that.
That's amazing. Sheikh Ebrahim, could you say something about Sufism for our time? I mean, this issue about bay'ah in some orders is essential. In others, there's a sort of probationary period, if you like, and before you then journey on, bay'ah is compulsory. In some orders, it's absolutely, once you've taken a bay'ah, there is no going to any other orders, and you're basically taken a pledge for this life and the next. I mean, there's variations of that. And and while certain structures would have been absolutely essential in the past, with the modern era and the challenges it brings from exponential change and growth to technology zapping our attention, what are the needs of the time, and how do you see that inner work taking place with so many outward distractions?
So I have two lives. I have a life as I have apparently rather two lives. A life as an organizational transformation consultant, and a life as a sheikh, basically. You know, there's actually no difference between the two. It's exactly the same endeavor in both. In both cases, the endeavor is to create the conditions where people can incrementally are comfortable with constructing their day-to-day engagement with life and with the other on the basis of giving or contributing unconditionally. Because when they do that, their whole life comes right. Everything comes right. You know, they don't have to worry about what they get from life. It looks after itself. So that for me is like the core principle that all this stuff is rooted in. Now, I think to do that successfully, you really have to take you need to take the turban and the sherbet off the message, because this is nothing other than what the Rasul said for his time. He tried to help people decode what it meant to be appropriate in that time. But people are lost in a morass of cultural accretion, which makes it impossible for them to work out the essential from the inessential. So my view of this is that bayah is not essential, and depending on what side of the bed I got out of in the morning, I might go as far as to say it's error, it's not guidance. You know, because it is not how this thing started. You know, for those 400 years before the tariqas became kind of caste in, like, you know, people used to travel, they used to move. You'd sit with somebody and you'd get from him, and then thank you very much, it was very insightful. You go to the next guy. That's how it used to work. Where's this thing suddenly come that somebody else has my ticket to the divine encounter? Surely that's shirk. You know, I mean, the divine encounter is proximate. He said, I'm closer to you than your jugular vein. So how can some other person claim to give me the key to me? There's just fundamentally, I don't think it's useful. I think I just, I mean, I'm going to stop there because I'm probably going to get myself into very hot water. I try not to be too contentious about these things, but so they might all be right and I might be wrong, and but you know, you have to live by your own conscience. And so as far as I'm concerned, you know, don't stay an hour later here than what you need to. And if I've outplayed my usefulness to you, for heaven's sake, move.
So, Sheikh Ebrahim, in your role as a consultant and a sheikh with addressing transformation, what role does technology have? Does technology have a role in that? I guess we're using technology right now in one sense to create this podcast.
So if you see the journey that Allah has put us on, it's a journey of occupying higher and higher platforms of increasing complexity, which are increasingly tenuous because it's very difficult. You know, the higher the platform becomes, the less stable it is. So that we have a deeper and deeper, greater and greater vantage point into how things are. And when we have a greater vantage point into how things are, we can be increasingly in awe with him and amazed with him. So I think that this current revolution that we're in now creates a possibility of a level of complexity. Like questions that you asked me before, like about Ibn Atayla. Well, actually, you know, if I really wanted to know, he's a Google search away. So all of that stuff's now irrelevant. You know, what used to stick in your head is irrelevant. So we're now operating as we can collaborate as a species now in ways that we could never collaborate before. So I think that we're in for one of the most extraordinary and enlightening rides that we've had as a species. I don't think the story is done. I think there's so many things that indicate we're at a cusp of the integration between the insights of what was called science and the insights of what was called religion. I mean, in the past, there's sort of some of the stuff that's being done at the sort of right at the vanguard of investigations into the effects of consciousness on phenomena. We're going to go into a new world, and that new world is going to present us with even more extraordinary possibilities for witnessing and awe, which is why Allah made us. So I think that technology is making possible a revival, a growth, a new thing that we wouldn't have had before.
Sheikh Ebrahim, what does it mean to be human, fully human?
So I'm going to say some things which the only reason why he's made us is so that we can be in awe. The reason why the human, because he said he made us because he wished to be known. And who is he? Well, he's everything that's superlative. He's everything, he's the greatest. And what is the effect of the greatest on that which is small? Well, either terror or awe. And you have to have the possibility of terror, otherwise you couldn't have awe. So the reason why we've been made is to be worshipful. Worshipful isn't just making lots of noises and professions in a strange language. It is being in a state of amazement, astonishment at the extraordinary improbability of it all. This is what the new world is making increasingly possible. We're beginning to understand just from the Big Bang, from our place on this tiny blue marble in this infinite inkiness of non-existence, that we should be at this. Just the scale of things makes the human being such an improbable thing. That produces in us, if you've got any honesty about you, what the astronauts call the overview effect. It's an effect of just, isn't it astonishing? Isn't it amazing? A sense of awe, and that's why we've been made. So to be fully human is to be in a state of awe. And there's actually only two ways of being human. The one is to be in a state of awe, and the other is to be in a state of terror. Because there's, if you stripped away everything else and asked yourself, well, what is being alive all about? Here I am, this kind of thing that looks sort of caught in a bag of skin, looking out around me, and let me get out of this tiny little room, but put myself on a mountain somewhere so I can get a good view. There's, the natural effect of just seeing things as they are, seeing the vastness of all of that next to is amazement, is awe. But the problem is that I am facing that which is potentially completely overwhelming. In fact, will overwhelm me at some point. So I'm either in awe or I'm in terror. And the only thing that makes it possible to move from terror to awe is that I do the thinking work, the rational work, the real fikr, the reflective work of decoding what I'm looking at, so that thing isn't just vast, but I actually see that which I'm apprehending out there is my benefactor and my ally. So it is the experience of gratitude and trust. Gratitude for whatever's put you here, this place where you can witness from, and trust that whatever you're looking at is fundamentally your ally. that then makes that makes all possible. Otherwise, you're in a state of terror. Both of those things, gratitude to and trust of, require recognizing a superlative intelligence on the other side of what you're looking at, an incomprehensible intelligence. In other words, not random. To be human means to, in this sense, to believe. In other words, to believe means to fully claim for yourself the insight that his face, that which you're looking at, is your benefactor and your ally, and it's on your side. And to know that as a first-hand experience, that's what it means to be human. The moment you start to deny that, you've actually sold yourself short in your humanity. You've reduced yourself to the status of an animal. So in this sense, being human also means to believe. When you don't believe, you're selling your humanity short. In a sense, you're a waste of a human skin.
Hey, Sheikh Ebrahim, for somebody who is doesn't have any background, say, for argument's sake, in religion, and is seeking authentic spirituality, if they were to ask you what is Islam, what would you say?
I would say that the word translated from Arabic means to submit. This goes back to the distinction we've just indicated. There's two ways of dealing with the problem of being the frightfully small in the face of the overwhelming. You can either be in awe or you can be in terror. When you're in awe, you recognize that that is your benefactor and your ally, and you're no longer contending with it. You submit. Whatever Allah brings you, you accept and you submit. Whereas if you view that as dangerous, then you're contending with it, then you resist. So there's two ways of being in the world, one of contention and resistance, and the other one is submission. What Islam gives you is the technology to submit. The Sawm, the Salah, the Hajj, that it gives you the technology to submit, so that you exercise a being in awe. And that's what Islam is for me. It's not an identity. I think people ruin this thing by turning it into an identity. So I'm very comfortable with multiple identities. I mean, I still use my birth name that my parents gave me, which is not in fact even a Christian name. It's a pagan name. It's like some Germanic sun god or something. And I use my Islamic name, and they're interchangeable, and they're like coats I wear, jackets for the day, and I think it's perfectly appropriate. It's not. Don't turn your deen into an identity, because if you turn your deen into an identity, it becomes a reason to be contending again. It's not about submitting. It's about contending. Us versus them. And there's all sorts of really undignified expressions of this. Like, did you know that Muslims worked out quarantine? That's ridiculous. That if it wasn't for the Arabs, we wouldn't have mathematics. What would you do? Honestly, why should this be a competition? Aren't we first human? Aren't we supposed to be collaborating as a species, not contending?
Sheikh Ebrahim, many people on social media and our listeners would heard of Sheikha Shahbana Aliani and her lovely poetry, which seemed to be sort of spiraling out from the unseen through her. Very, very creative. And I didn't know her too well, but I always felt it was inspired by her interaction with you. I'm assuming she was one of your students.
She was, yes.
Could you say a bit about her and her poetry?
She really was an absolutely extraordinary being, like sort of in the class of Sheikh Mustafa. This is, you no longer, doesn't matter what, park the words in the text. Just sitting in the person's pew, you realize there was something here. So I first met her. There's a DJ in Karachi called Khalid Malik, and we were having a dhikr in his flat. Now you're talking a good 15 years ago, I'm sure. I can't remember how long ago now. And she came to this dhikr. And then after that, she kept the conversation alive, and at one point she came to the Zawiya. She stayed here for a couple of weeks. She went into Khalwa, and then I recognized this woman's talent, and dare I say, I wanted to kind of pinch her for our business, because she was, and apart from anything else, she's incredibly intelligent and had a very good nose for organizational work. So she started working with us, and then unfortunately she got ill, and just became increasingly insupportable for her to do the work. I gave her idhn probably about 2 years before she passed, I think, 2 or 3 years before she passed. Yeah. But she was immensely generous with hundreds of people. She obviously wasn't in the position to do anything kind of in congregation, because she was really desperately ill. Her whole skeleton had crumpled in on itself, so she became this tiny wizened ball of pain. But she always had time for people. People would text her and she'd answer, and I found that she had a patience that I just thought was angelic. Just nothing that I had. So I found her, really one of the most extraordinary beings I've ever had the pleasure to encounter. I have met some extraordinary beings in this journey, and she's one of the select. Very, very rare. Not too many people like that in the world.
And was poetry always her thing? Was she always a poetess, or is that something that sort of came through the path?
It started when she came on the path. And sometimes it is like it would just sprout from, like gush from her, But right from the start, there was an element of the almost, because it was so spontaneous. There's an element of the sort of deeply inspired in the stuff. That kind of. So certainly, I don't think I could have stopped her, but I did as much as I could to encourage her to continue writing.
And what about Sheikh Harun from Karachi? I've had a few exchanges with him, which quite interesting, maybe for another time. But I know he was very close to you. Could you say a few words about him?
His daughter's my daughter-in-law. She's married to my son. We had a peculiar relationship, myself and this man. It was we fought like brothers, It was quite strange. We'd be in each other's company for a day, and we'd be bickering about the tea. It was quite bizarre. But I knew, I met him first in Karachi at a dhikr. But I was very exhausted at the time, so I didn't register with this man. And then we went on another trip to Morocco. This was after Sheikh Mustafa had passed. And there was a few of us who had gone, a few from people from South Africa. There was somebody who joined us from Scotland, and he decided he was going to go on this trip. And the moment I saw the man, I think I had an experience not dissimilar from the experience of Mustafa had with me. I just knew this guy was not recognized for what he was. And so I said to him, why are they treating you like this? Why are they not recognizing who you are? And well, he sort of muttered a couple of things, and then I said, well, as far as I'm concerned, you're a sheikh. This is people should be taking you seriously. You're a rare breed. So it was the end of that trip that I gave him in. But it was always not an easy relationship. I mean, because you see somebody's depth and insight, that doesn't necessarily mean we're all twee with each other. You know? And so we had a very disputatious relationship.
So historically, he was, correct me if I'm wrong, from the Chishtiya order or
He
path,
was, but
because
he had crossed. So he had touched signs with the Darqawa, with the Shadaliya. He also had a short sojourn with both Sheikh Fadlala and Sheikh Abdul Qadir with the Marabitun. So it kind of traveled around a bit. But it was really that his relationship with the name of his Sheikh escapes me now, man from Karachi, also an Englishman, was not dissimilar from my experience. From what he accounted, was not recounted to me, was not dissimilar from my experience with Sheikh Mustafa. It was just an instant, absolutely visceral recognition.
yes, I remember a few years back when I had a couple of email exchanges with him. He said something to the effect of having a spiritual connection with Hazrat Baba Farid.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
And was in some sort of connection. But I always felt he had, although we never physically met, he had a lot of deep insight into the things that I was asking him.
There's no question about it. The man was rare. He was, No, I mean, I'm very fortunate to have him here because his daughter is here, and she's very much her father's child. You know, she's the same qualities.
Sheikh Ibrahim, could you end with some advice for seekers of truth, or some nuggets, some takeaways, some guidance for listeners of this podcast who are seeking authentic spirituality in the current time? I mean, for yourself, just to put this into context, there was no rational thought, as you said. It was from the heart, and you just knew it happened. And for some people who are blessed with that encounter, the whole situation is effectively resolved. You know where you need to be and what you need to do and what the divine reality has planned for you. Whereas others often ask, how do you know which sheikh is your authentic sheikh, or which path is an authentic path? And it's very easy for people to either get trapped sometimes in the worst case scenario through a bayah type of sort of pledge, which they might or might not fully understand, especially if they are entering Islam through Sufism. And on the other hand, I'm just painting a picture of two extremes here. On the other hand, you have spiritual window shoppers who would come in and dabble around for a bit and then just simply move on. But in it's very easy for the nafs, as I'm sure you'll know better than me, to come in through the back door, especially when you're on the spiritual path, trying to do this inner work and saying, actually, your work here is done, you need to move on, or you need to stay, etc. So what advice would you have for seekers of sacred knowledge and truth in the current climate? And before you answer that, Sheikh Ibrahim, maybe one more thing to add is, in this spectrum that I'm drawing out, you also have people who tend to be of the Islamic faith, in that they've been brought up in the Islamic household, and whether they have cultural ideas of Islam or it's turned into an identity for them. The perspective of a strong emphasis on legalism, as though the whole of Islam is encoded within some laws that and that's the purpose of existence. And yet, if you strip that down, even behind that, there's a sincerity that just wants, that's yearning for something authentic, but the only narrative sometimes they have is that it's through a strict or a more sincere adherence to a set of laws, even within a cultural conditioned mindset, if you like. So you have a variety of things going on here. So what would your advice be to seekers of sacred knowledge and truth?
If I understand correctly, you're saying, how should one view, sort of reverse order to your questions, how should one view people who are sort of committed to a culturally encoded understanding of their deen? And it's all about rule compliance and, if you like, their count in akhirah, sort of like the sawab clicking, that one way of looking at it. And then on the other hand, what would be my advice to the people who are trying to pursue their own inner development? So, in terms of the first category of people, I would suggest not to have any dispute with them, and not to put yourself into a situation where you end up in a disputatious engagement with them. I don't know whether we actually have the same deen. I don't know. I don't know whether when I put my head on the masala and that person puts their head, that the same thing is happening behind their eyes. I could never know. Now, for all I know, that's what's happening with them is actually superior than what's happening to me. But all that I can say is that way of looking at life, the sort of sawab counting and the sort of excessive legalism, just doesn't float my boat. So I'm probably looking at sort of a subset of people who are kind of odd fish like myself, who find that sort of very legalistic way of approaching things a little bit unnerving. So for somebody like myself, I would say to them, there is a Rabb. He has a greater interest in you arriving home than you have, because he created you to be the wanderer, and he created you to be the one who comes home. And he will, by his own promise, take 10 steps to you with every step that you take to him. And all that you have to do in any context that you're in is ask yourself, what does he really want from me now? What is the contribution he wants me to make here? And when you do that with absolute sincerity and as unconditionally as you can, in other words, it's given to give away, he will deliver you to a higher place of witnessing, where an even greater contribution will become apparent for you to make. So it oscillates between witnessing and acting, witnessing and acting, witnessing and acting. And actually, it's not a sheikh that does that for you. It's he does it for you. He's put you in exile. He wants you to come home. And he's he's far more eloquent at giving directions than any human sheikh could ever conceivably be. So in fact, the best sheikhs are actually normally people who are actually spiritually somewhat clumsy. It's like the best coach has never been the best athlete. The role of the sheikh is not to be this pristine being kind of emanating light at the top of the mountain. That's not useful. The role of the sheikh is to be somewhere halfway up the mountain, to say, hey, the top is over there. That's the direction. That's a good guide. A good guide isn't somebody who's this angelic being, that kind of, eats sherbet and floats 3 millimeters off the ground. I don't think that's helpful. So trust that there is a creative genius that sits behind the design of your life. Trust that that creative genius has made you to see him and his works from a vantage point that only you can, a unique vantage point. And he is busy leading you there. And he will bring you in the company of people that will be helpful to you the next part up this steep ascent to your witnessing place. And he will take you away from people, And if you're halfway up here and you suddenly decide, no, I'm committing to this thing, I think that's a mistake, because maybe it's not as far as this thing can go. And who knows how far it can go, So trust that there's a manager in charge of the affair, and he's, by his own admission, he's the planner, and his plans are gobsmacking, just extraordinary.
On that note, Shaykh Ebrahim, the last time we met at SOAS in London, you gave a talk and you said you had, I think, become financially bankrupt, or you were just in a difficult situation, but it was the best thing that had ever happened to you.
Yeah.
Could you say, how is that going? Could you say a bit more?
Well, I mean, this, so the industry that we were in required us to be traveling around the world and being in training rooms and being in boardrooms, and this virus kept us caged for 6 months. And it's been the most extraordinary experience of my life. I mean, I now know what it feels like not to be an exhausted adult. It's the most extraordinary experience. It's so consistently in my life, it's when you're kind of bereft, you've played your hand. No more cards left. You've now. That's when he demonstrates to you that he, in fact, has this. He will pluck victory from the jaws of catastrophic failure time and again. He leaves it to you to get yourself to the point of catastrophic failure, so he can sort of toss in the opening. I think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has got the most amazing sense of humor, that has a superlative tease.
Amazing.
Just when you think you're completely cornered, there's no way out. It turns out to be the biggest blessing of your life. That's consistently been, in fact, that's not gone away, You expect that this thing gets less so as you get older, or as you get as you develop yourself. This is, I now trade catastrophes in a sense by the hour almost. Sometimes it feels like, it's a kind of like, yeah. Alhamdulillah. So I can bear witness that there's a genius that has taken charge of my life, which is infinitely bigger than my own capacity, and that my own capacity consistently comes up short with the complexity that my life produces, and that he's always come through. He's always opened. He's always shown the next step. So I feel a little bit like Jung. If somebody asked me, do you believe in Allah? I would say, well, that's a very strange question. I wouldn't know how to answer that question, because I don't believe in Allah. I know Allah, and He's real. It's absolutely almost tactile for me. It's like real. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Shaykh Ebrahim, final question. Could you say something about Carlos
Castaneda? So Carlos, so I told you I had this sort of wandering youth, and as an adolescent, I came across the writings of Carlos Castaneda, and I mean, I kind of came from quite a working class background, and none of not a lot of kind of culture, I suppose, in my background. But this man, his insights were just so extraordinary. And I think the thing that really the essence of Castaneda, ask me, what's the essence of Castaneda? Is an absolutely radical rejection of victimhood of any kind. Fundamental, radical rejection of victimhood of any kind. And I mean, as an adolescent, you're such a victim. You just are. I mean, the whole world's out to get you, don't you know? So when I read this man and I saw, but there's a way of looking at life where you accept such a level of accountability that you could die at any moment. Yeah, that just blew me away. So, I mean, there's with subsequent reading of Castaneda, there's a number of really clever, what can you call them? Devices and tools and insights that you can gain from Castaneda. But the critical, if I say what is the essence of it, is this radical rejection of victimhood.
Shaykh Ebrahim, I'd like to thank you for your time and for blessing us with this opportunity to be able to listen to you. And really, it's been a pleasure, and I am short of words for learning about your journey and the insights that you've provided us, and I'm sure many listeners will feel the same.
Thank you, Sahib. It was very nice talking to you again.
Likewise. Inshallah, maybe another podcast in the future.
Ameen. You'll be very welcome.
Thank you.
All the best. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.